Max Hunter wasn't your average private investigator. For most people, solving mysteries meant looking for physical clues, fingerprints, phone records, surveillance footage. But Max's cases took him into a realm where few dared to venture the human mind. He was a reclaimer, a specialist who could enter the memories of others, searching for lost information, hidden secrets, and even repressed truths. It all started after a breakthrough technology called the NeuroLink. It allowed individuals to sync their consciousness with another person's mind, diving into their memories and experiencing their past in vivid, sometimes distorted detail. But while most people used this for entertainment or therapy, Max used it for his work. His clients were usually desperate people who needed answers, who couldn't remember what had happened, or who wanted to uncover something they'd long buried. His latest case, however, was different. One evening, as Max sat in his small, dimly lit office, a woman walked in. She was tall, with dark, intense eyes and a quiet grace. She didn't say much at first, just handed him a file. Inside was the name of her husband, Ethan Wolfe, a well-known tech magnate who had mysteriously disappeared a year ago. No trace of him had been found. No clues, no body, nothing. "I need you to find him," she said, her voice steady but laced with desperation. Max leaned back in his chair, studying her. "If he's missing, what do you expect me to find?" "He's not just missing," she whispered. "He's somewhere inside himself. The doctors say he's in a vegetative state, but I know Ethan. He wouldn't just disappear like this. Something happened to him, something in his mind." Max hesitated. He had dealt with many cases, but entering the mind of someone who wasn't fully conscious was dangerous. The deeper the unconscious state, the harder it was to pull yourself out. But the case intrigued him. Ethan Wolfe wasn't just anyone. He was the inventor of the NeuroLink itself. The idea that he could be trapped in his own creation fascinated Max. "All right," Max said finally. "I'll do it." 2 days later, Max found himself standing in a sterile hospital room, next to the motionless form of Ethan Wolfe. His face was pale, and his eyes were closed, as if he were in a deep, dreamless sleep. Max prepared the NeuroLink device, connecting himself to Ethan's brain activity. He felt the familiar jolt as the machine synchronized with his neural pathways. The world around him blurred, then shifted, and suddenly he was no longer in the hospital room. He was inside Ethan's mind. The first thing Max noticed was how disjointed everything felt. He stood in the middle of a bustling city. Skyscrapers rose around him. The streets were packed with people. But everything was slightly off. The sky was the wrong shade of green. The buildings twisted unnaturally, as if reality itself was struggling to hold itself together. Max had seen this before. It was what happened when someone's subconscious tried to suppress memories. Fragments of reality would warp and distort to hide the truth. He would have to dig deeper to find Ethan. Max started walking, blending in with the crowd. As he moved through the streets, he felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the mind was aware of his presence. He needed to be careful. If the subconscious recognized him as an intruder, it would try to eject him violently if necessary. He found himself drawn to a towering building in the distance. Something about it seemed significant. As he approached, he noticed the people around him acting strangely. They began to stare, their movements becoming robotic, their eyes blank. The closer he got to the building, the more aggressive they became. They started following him, their faces contorting into grotesque shapes. Max quickened his pace, pushing his way through the crowd until he reached the doors of the building and slipped inside. The interior was vast, dark, and empty. It felt like a cavern, the walls stretching endlessly into the shadows. And then, in the center of the room, he saw him, Ethan Wolfe. He stood there, looking out of place in a business suit, his face expressionless. But something was wrong. Ethan wasn't moving. He was like a statue, frozen in time. Max approached cautiously. "Ethan?" There was no response. Max reached out, gently touching Ethan's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, the entire room shifted. Suddenly, they weren't in the dark cavern anymore. They were in Ethan's office, the memory of the day he disappeared. Max watched as Ethan sat at his desk, working on something, a new prototype of the NeuroLink. But then, something strange happened. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to glitch. Ethan's face twisted in confusion as the walls began to distort, warping and changing like the city outside. Max realized with horror what had happened. Ethan had become trapped in a feedback loop within his own device. He had been experimenting with a new level of the NeuroLink, one that could potentially map out the subconscious in even more detail. But something had gone wrong. The system had glitched, and instead of mapping Ethan's memories, it had trapped him inside them. The memory began to collapse around them. Ethan's office shattered into 1,000 pieces, and Max found himself back in the distorted city, the subconscious defenses closing in on him again. "I have to get him out of here," Max muttered to himself. But Ethan's mind was resisting. It didn't want to let go. The city began to twist violently, buildings crumbling and the sky darkening. Max could feel the weight of the mind trying to eject him, to trap him inside the loop with Ethan. But Max wasn't new to this. He had a plan. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, one he had designed himself, an emergency trigger for the NeuroLink. If he could activate it inside the mind, it would send a jolt through the system, breaking the loop and pulling them both out. The ground trembled beneath him as the subconscious figures closed in, their faces blank and hollow. Max ran through the crumbling streets, heading for the center of the city, where he knew the feedback loop was strongest. He reached the center just as the figures lunged at him. Without hesitating, Max activated the trigger. There was a blinding flash of light, and the world dissolved around him. Max jolted awake in the hospital room, gasping for breath. The NeuroLink had disengaged. He glanced over at Ethan, who remained motionless in his bed. But then, Ethan stirred. His fingers twitched, his eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in a year, Ethan Wolfe returned to consciousness. Max let out a sigh of relief. He had done it. He had reclaimed Ethan from his own mind. But as Ethan sat up, his eyes filled with confusion, Max realized something. There was a flicker in Ethan's gaze, a shadow of doubt. Ethan turned to Max, his voice shaky. "Am I still in there?" Max's heart sank. He hadn't just pulled Ethan out of the feedback loop. He had pulled them both into something far deeper.